There's other elements of existentialism that I think are extremely interesting. For example, the definition of truth in existentialism is different than the definition of truth that might be characteristic of objective materialism. So truths that are truths from the perspective of objective materialism are scientific truths, and they're usually descriptive truths. And so the truth claims of science go something like this: I'll undertake a procedure which I'll tell you about, and I'll observe the outcomes, and then if you undertake that procedure and you observe the outcomes and the outcomes are the same, you know, and we'll do this maybe 100 times just to be certain, then we'll assume that what that outcome is real. So it's a definition of a procedure, that's the experiment that elicits the outcome, and then the demonstration that the outcome is constant across observers. So that's a lovely definition of truth, and it obviously has extreme utility, partly because it helps you separate subjective fantasy, which is a form of reality, from other forms of realities. So another form of reality would be collectively apprehensible reality. You don't want to confuse those two things. In fact, that's actually a sign of, if not naivety and a state of undeveloped differentiation, it can also be a sign of insanity, because one of the things, say, that characterizes schizophrenics is they can't tell the difference between what only they experience and what everybody else experiences. So the scientific definition of truth is a perfectly reasonable definition, but it's not the existential definition of truth. The existential definition of truth is more action predicated. So for the existentialists, truth is a way of being. It's not a collection of descriptions. So it's more embodied, you know, from the Piagetian point of view. And so truth is reflected in what you act. So Nietzsche would say, for example, it doesn't matter what you say. It matters what you do. And if I want to figure out what you believe, I don't ask you. I watch how you act. And I assume that your true beliefs are those that are directing your actions. And so truth is discovered in action. And that's a very different claim, you know, and it's not the claim of a passive observer. It's the claim of someone who's actively interacting with the world. And of course, we're always acting interactively with the world. And not only that, if we don't act interactively with the world, we cease to exist. So we have to do that merely to maintain ourselves. And so the existential claim would be, given that's in our essential nature, there are ways that you can act that are they're improper. And technically, it's like, for example, let's say you want A, and then you act in a bunch of ways that makes it absolutely impossible that you will get A. It's like an existentialist would say, well, there's something wrong with that schema. Like it's not necessarily immoral, because that would only be if you were willfully blind to it, but they would certainly say, well, it's got this self-contradictory element that makes it wrong. So insofar, it's like this, insofar as you're acting towards an aim. You want something. And then insofar as you want something, the fact that you want it constitutes the framework within which you evaluate the utility and truth of your actions, right? So it's like you come up with a theory of truth just because you're doing something, and the theory is A, that what you want is acceptable to want, and you know, that can be true or not, but it doesn't matter, you just assume that, and B, that those things that will get you to that end are appropriate. You can't get out of that if you're doing something. You're making a claim about the structure of the world and what constitutes appropriate action as soon as you make any action. You can't get out of that. Nietzsche said, "Can one live it? All truths are bloody truths to me." And that's one of the things I really like about reading the existentialists too. It's not, there's no abstract disembodiment in their philosophy. You see that the people who are writing as existentialists are committed to what they say. They want to enact what they say in the world. It's romantic because it does involve emotions and motivation. See, with reason alone, Enlightenment view of reason was that reason and the passions were antagonistic, that all the passions could do would be to cloud reason, and that it was reason's job to lift itself up above the body and the emotions and clarify the nature of the world. the existentialists would deny that completely. They would say, no, 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 it's that the purpose, the appropriate mode of being is to act properly. And rationality can be a guide to that, but it can also deceive in all sorts of ways. The passions inform you. They don't cloud your reasoning, although of course they can, because they tend to be kind of single-minded, you know, they can take you off course. But that doesn't mean that they're enemies of rational clarity per se. And when the existentialists write, you can tell they put their whole being into it, so it's gripping and passionate. The existentialists have also identified sort of classes of pathology that are unique in some ways. They're outside the purview of standard psychology and psychiatry. So you see often, if you're looking at debates, say, between atheists and religious people, one of the things that tends to set the atheists back on their heels is the observation that the religious people make that if there's no final meaning to anything, then there's no meaning to anything. And so that immediately elicits a kind of nihilism. It's like, if nothing means anything, why do anything? And it's a reasonable argument, because doing things requires effort. And you can say to yourself, well, why should I do X or Y, especially if X is difficult, if who the hell's going to know in 1,000 years, or who the hell's going to know in 100 years, or why does it matter anyways? And then the atheists will tie themselves up in knots trying to address that issue. But the existentialists take a different perspective. Nietzsche said, for example, he viewed the emergence of nihilism as a kind of cultural pathology. And so you remember, of course, that it was Nietzsche who said, God is dead. Right? You see that scrawled out in like washroom graffiti from time to time, you know. It's like a truism, but that isn't what Nietzsche said. He said, God is dead and we have killed him and we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood, which is a very, very different statement. It wasn't like he was proclaiming it triumphantly. It was more like a catastrophic loss of meaning. You know, the sort of loss of meaning that the terror management theorists would say would produce like a traumatic pathology. Now what Nietzsche observed was that there, you know, and of course you all know this to some degree, that in the course of the development of scientific knowledge and rationality, that a contradiction between our historical moral knowledge, formulated in religious terms, and our descriptive rational knowledge emerged, conflict between science and religion. Now part of that conflict is illusory, because the purpose of religion is to tell you how to act, and the purpose of science is to provide clear descriptions of what? Universally apprehensible reality. They're not working in precisely the same domains. It doesn't matter. Nietzsche's observation was this. He said, well, it's pretty clear that the scientific rationalists are going to demolish the substructure of Western religious belief, and then of course the substructure of that sort of belief all the way around the world. And there's going to be consequences to that. And he said there's going to be two consequences. And he predicted this, say, in 1850. It's something like 1850 in Will to Power. It's unbelievable. He said that what's going to happen in Europe is that there'll be the rise of socialist/communist utopian schemes that will possess people, and that will produce a war, and the consequence of that war will be that hundreds of millions of people die. And he predicted that like 80 years before it happened. Well, maybe less if you think of the Russian Revolution as a precursor of that, which Dostoevsky would have certainly viewed it as a precursor of that. Now, so there's totalitarianism on one side. That's one of the dangers. Another danger is nihilism, and the nihilism emerges because you shatter the meaning structure within which action is conceptualized. And so those are like two emergent pathologies that threaten people. Now, if you talk to someone who's nihilistic, and rationalists are almost always nihilistic, especially if they're depressed, they'll say things like I already told you, what difference does it make anyways? Now, Dostoevsky played out those themes, for example, in a very, very powerful way in a number of his books. So, The Possessed, for example, it's funny because Dostoevsky and Nietzsche wrote at the same time, and Dostoevsky wrote literature and Nietzsche wrote philosophy, but they were doing exactly the same thing. In Dostoevsky's The Possessed, he talked about description of the Russian political, economic, ideological scene, and what he saw happening was that as people moved away from their enmeshment in a historically conditioned meaning system, so that was, say, Judeo-Christianity, that they started to become susceptible to utopian, rationalist utopian ideologies. It was so out with one belief system and in with another. And the other was more dangerous because, like, the religious system sort of emerged from the bottom up, and they were weird and mythical and difficult to understand from a rationalist perspective, whereas the utopian schemes were rational constructions, ideologies, very narrow, and they were just imposed on people. So, for example, the communists would say, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, which sounds wonderful, but if you put it into practice, it's like it's instantly genocidal. So Nietzsche said, well, as the modern world suffers through the contradiction between scientific rationality and ritual religion, historically conditioned, the consequence of that is going to be that two pathologies will emerge. One is reliance on totalitarianism. And so I would say, to the degree that any of you are ideological, then you've succumbed to the one pole of post-religious pathology. And all you've done is replace adherence to one set of beliefs, even though religious beliefs are not precisely beliefs, with another that's rationally constructed and incredibly dangerous. He said, well, if it isn't going to be totalitarianism, it's going to be nihilism. But the thing that's so interesting about the existentialists is they make a forthright claim that regardless of whether or not the fact that people will turn to those alternatives is a rational, can be rationalized. It makes sense that it would happen. It's still pathological. It's like an a priori statement. So I could say, well, let's say you're nihilistic. You know, you have a lot of doubt about life's meaning and purpose, and it's like it's eating at you. It's a disease of the soul. And you come to me and you tell me 30 logical reasons why what you say has to be true. And I would say, those are excellent logical reasons, and you're making a very powerful argument. But it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The fact that you're nihilistic means that you're infected with a pathology. And whether or not you can justify it rationally is completely irrelevant. All it means is that your rational mind is capable of spinning off a sequence of logical tricks. And the ultimate truth is, it's undermining your ability to live. And so it's wrong. Why is it wrong? I don't care why it's wrong. It's not relevant why it's wrong. What's relevant is you can't live like that. And that's an existential claim. Because the existentialists are interested in a different kind of truth. They would say that a truth you cannot live is not true. Because their definition of truth is different. It's predicated on action. And then the totalitarianism claim is the same thing. So let's say that you're an ardent right-winger, or you're an ardent socialist, or you're an ardent feminist, or an environmentalist, or who cares what the ism is. You've abstracted out a bunch of axioms, you develop a coherent representation of the world, and it's pathological. It doesn't matter what the content is. It's pathological because it's not you. It's not you. If it was you, then a million other people wouldn't believe it. So the existentialist would say, if a million other people believe it, it's definitely false. And they're not talking about scientific claims. That's a whole different order of discussion and description. They're merely making the point that you're an individual thing. And if you've been unable to particularize your experience, and you've replaced that with adherence to some sort of arbitrary and universal call to action or representation, you're pathological. It's a form of mental illness. And you might say, well, what's the evidence for that? Well, what we'll find out in the next lecture is the 20th century was evidence for that. Not so much for the nihilism aspect. I think that we're still in for that. Because I think we swung to totalitarianism first, and that didn't work. And so now, you see this in postmodernism, for example. It's an unbelievably nihilistic philosophy, because it claims that all meaning, for example, is reducible to motivations of power, which is like intellectually simplistic beyond belief, and it comes straight out of like 1950s Marxism, and you know, it's pretty much permeated the humanities and the study of literature at universities all over North America. It's sick beyond belief to teach young people that all meaning is relative. It's the last thing you guys need to hear when you're like 20. And the reason that people teach it is because they're more afraid that things might have meaning than they are afraid that things might not. Because you might ask yourself, well, here's two options. One is, it doesn't bloody well matter what you do. Who the hell cares? Who's going to know in 1,000 years? And everything's relative. Well, you think, God, nothing could be worse than that. Well, I can tell you something that would be worse than that. It's easy. Let's take the reverse. Everything you do matters. Okay, so what's the downside of that? It's like you don't get away with anything. Everything you do is important. It's linked to everything else. It's like, okay, now choose. You got a choice. You can either choose to believe, nihilistically, that nothing has any meaning. Well, you get to be depressed and anxious, and maybe you're impulsive because that's the only kind of pleasure you can find, but the advantage is, you don't have any responsibility. You can do whatever you want. And if a psychoanalyst would say, maybe that's why you believe it. That's a secondary gain, right? You think you believe it because you've derived it logically. It's like, yeah, sure. No. You believe it because it's in the best interest of the worst aspects of you to believe it. Because it justifies sloth and cynicism. Well, the opposite is, yeah, what you do matters. It's like, well, why not believe that? Well, try believing it seriously and see what happens. You take the existential claim seriously. One of them is, you make a mistake, especially one that you know is a mistake, you will absolutely pay for it. And worse, that you'll never get away with it. And worse than that, it'll domino out into the world. So not only will you pay for it, but the people that you're connected with will pay for it. There's always a price. It's like, well, you decide which of those two things is more terrifying. You know, when you read Freud, and Freud says, religion is a defense against death anxiety. Well, that's a good argument. But it is not by no means clear to me at all that the reverse of that, which is the idea that things have intrinsic meaning and that you have like an intrinsic responsibility, it's by no means clear to me that that's a comforting idea. It could easily be that the more comforting idea is that, you know, you're just a speck in a collection of specks and what you do doesn't matter. Well, you can sit and play video games for the rest of your life and it isn't going to make any difference. It doesn't have any significance. Well, if the opposite is true, you know, every time you do something pathological, especially if you know it's pathological, you tilt the whole world towards pathology. And so the existentialists would say of the 20th century, we just about annihilated ourselves. Once in 1962, and then once again in the early 80s. We're this far away from nuclear annihilation. You might ask yourself, well, why didn't we do it? And the existential answer would be, as a collective, human beings decided that it would be better to continue being than not to. And the way they decided that was by shifting the ratio of their pathological to honest behaviors a little bit more towards honesty. And you know, you might wonder about this sort of thing, if this kind of thing could possibly be true. Well, that's why I have you read Frankl and Solzhenitsyn. You know, they're not classic personality theorists, but it doesn't matter to me because they're getting at something that's deeper than the terror management theorists or the people who deal with positive illusions. They're trying to make a case based on the analysis of an entire bloody century. And the case is, societies become carnivorous and pathological in precise proportion to the degree that the individuals who make up that society become deceitful and irresponsible. And I've never encountered a political or economic analysis or claim that has anywhere near the power of that. But it's a terrifying proposition, even though what you get out of it is, well, your life is meaningful. Your life is meaningful. And then if all of a sudden you find that you're suffering unnecessarily, this is a weird thing too about meaning claims, you know. Someone's nihilistic, they come and talk to you, they say, well, my life has there's no meaning in my life. And I say, well, how do you feel about that? And they say, well, I'm really feeling bad. And then you say, well, that's a meaning. feeling bad, being anxious, hurting. Those are meanings. They're just not very good meanings. And so then you might also ask yourself, if your philosophy throws you in the direction of overwhelming negative emotion, anxiety, and pain, and that's a meaning, you might note, you're not going to argue yourself out of that. You know, which shows that there's a meaning basis. You can't just all of a sudden decide you're not hurting, you're not anxious. You don't have control over that. The meaning of your pain is completely impenetrable to your rational mind. So even if you're nihilistic, you have to admit to the meaning of negative emotion. Well, then what do? You just deny the existence of anything positive? Well, why is that reasonable? Maybe it's just that, well, you could be unlucky and maybe you're not well. You know, and maybe you have reasons to be suffering that have nothing to do with the way you're construing the world. Because people do get unlucky. But there's always the possibility that the reason that things are so terrible for you is that you're inhabiting a pathological perspective. And that's an existential point of view. Can somebody tell me what time it is? It's what? Oh, well, good. Then we can stop. We'll see you after reading week.